We need to say that. Okay, let's start. Torah. It's hard to, like Carol has to, let people in, put on the brachas. It's a lot. Okay, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, also b'divrei Torah. Okay, the Harev Nan, make the Torah sweet, and sweet is really is what we're talking about today. Sweetness. Sweetness. I was only joking when okay, so the Torah, this Shabbos, obviously Shabbat Shirah, thanks Victor. Shabbos Shirah, it's Pashat Shalach, it's always Shabbat Shirah, and it coincides almost always within the week of the Shavuot Shechalbo, Tu B'Shvat, and so there's Tu B'Shvat is the holiday of the trees, and the Rosh Hashanah of the trees, so Shana Tova, if you're a tree, and it's the connection between the two is that of course the Song of the Sea and the Song of Creation are connected. Parak Shirah, that in the rabbinic tradition, everything is singing a song. The Song of Creation, the Song of the trees, the Song of the frogs, the songs of all of the world, and we're going to pick up the story though after the Song of the Sea, immediately after the Song of the Sea, because at the end of the Song of the Sea, there's also the little addendum, which is the Song of Miriam. And then right after the Song of Miriam, Miriam goes out and she brings a second song or an additional song, which is similar to the Song of the Sea, at least in one verse. And then chapter 15 will give way to these mysterious verses. Vayatha Moshe. Oh, okay. Callan? You can share the text on the screen for the Chevra. Vayasa Moshe Yisrael miyam Suf. And Moshe caused the children of Israel to set out to move from the Yam Suf, the sea of Suf, which is reeds. Why does he have to make them go, by the way, parenthetically? Why does he have to tell us that he made them leave? Because he said, Yisrael, and then the children of Israel kept leaving. So the Midrash picks up on this Moshe business that Moshe is making them leave. Why? Because they were all they were taking the spoils. They were stuck like in Fort Knox. They were like he had to say, guys, let's go. And they're all sitting there trying to take the loot, the booty that was from the Egyptians, which was, by the way, in the rabbinic tradition, that's part of what's about to happen. That they couldn't leave. That they needed Moshe to tell them, now that you're free, it's time to get going. Leave the riches behind. Vayetzu el Midbar Shur, and they left and they went out to this Midbar called Midbar Shur. Vayelchu Shloshes Yamim, and they went 3 days in the desert by Midbar, v'lo matzu mayim, and they didn't find water. It's amazing just to think about it for a second before we get into it. Like this is the next story in the story of the Exodus. They just were saved from the water. Water is everywhere, rather. It's like water begins. The story of Exodus begins with the water and the Nile and the war between Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh and the Nile and the Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh and Pharaoh, all the different gods of Egypt. And Moshe's name means the one who was pulled from the water, right? He then stands with them at the water of the Yam Suf. The Yam Suf parts, they walk out, and the next theme is, of course, the lack of water. Was there a lack of water until this point? Water, so much water that kills, water that lives, that gives life. Okay, but now water is lacking. Also, the connection, obviously, to Miriam. And later on in the text, we'll know that when Miriam dies, they also complain about water, which leads the rabbis to say that Miriam was the source of the water. But it's not a small deal literarily that the verses right before these are about Miriam's song. Miriam's name means Maryam, the bitter sea, and the letters of her name, Mem, Resh, Yud, Mem, are going to appear here also in the word Mara and Marim and so on. So there's a lot about Miriam, about water. It's really fascinating, right? Just as a theme, that it continues this way. So they go 3 days without water. Vayavo Marasa, they come to a place called Marah, V'lo yachlu lishtos mayim. And now they come to a place called Mara, which has water, apparently, but they can't drink it. V'lo yachlu lishtos mayim mimara. And just, right, in an oral culture, by the way, before all these things are written down, just listen to this phonetically. Like for those musicians in the room and the rest of us also who hear language this way. Vayavo marasa v'lo yachlu lishtos mayim mimara ki marim hein. Al ken karshma mara. Mara, mara, mara. Right? It's like there's a lot of these linguistic, these phonetic elements that are repetitious and redundant to some extent, or even tongue twisters, incantational maybe. They can't drink water from Mara, which is not yet, we don't know that Mara is named Mara because they couldn't drink water from Mara. They come to a place whose name is bitterness, but is named before it's named. Like the nominal is already introduced before it's been explained, which is not an uncommon feature of the Torah, where they'll say they came to a place and then they tell us what happened at the place, that its name is from what happened, but they already told us what its name was. We know that its name is Mara, but we don't know why its name is Mara, and then we get the information. Why is it called Mara? Was it Mara before they got there and they couldn't drink the waters from Mara? But they can't drink the waters because they're marim, because they're bitter. And therefore, that's the name that was given to the place, Mara. Okay. Are we following this it's weird, okay. But it's beautiful too, because we know that something about bitter waters, right? There are waters that are too bitter to drink. And so the children of Israel come to this place, they're thirsty. They're 3 days without water, they need water. They come to a place that has water, but the water is undrinkable. Right? Vayilonu am, so they began to complain. Pasuk Chavdal, verse 24. Vayilonu am al Moshe lemor, ma nishteh. They said to they start complaining to Moshe, what are we supposed to drink? So is that a good complaint? It's a pretty good complaint. I mean,
Is that a complaint?
it says that they complain because they say Vayilonu. Like if it wouldn't have told us that it was a complaint, we might not have thought it was a complaint. It's like a reasonable thing to ask of a leader. It's like we're dying of thirst here. What are we supposed to drink? Vayilonu am al Moshe, but the Torah describes it as a tluna, like a Vayilonu is like a tlunot in Hebrew is a complaint. They complained against Moshe, and they said Manishte. But apparently Moshe doesn't rebuke them. He cries out to God. Vayitzak el Adonai. And this is where it gets interesting, very interesting. Vayitzak el Adonai, vayoreu Adonai eitz. He calls out to God, and we don't see that God responds verbally or in any, like just God says, okay, vayoreu Adonai eitz. And God shows him a tree.
Piece of wood.
Yeah, eitz, or a piece of wood, right? It says piece of wood, but eitz is a tree. Vayashlich el hamayim, and he throws it into the water. Desalination, debitterization, something. He throws a piece of wood onto water. Vayim tiku hamayim, and the waters become sweet. Okay, scene. And then gloss, right? There's a little gloss here. Sham sam lo chok umishpat, v'sham nisahu. Another clear alliteration and tongue twister. Like this would be like she sells seashells by the seashore, right? Sam sham lo chok umishpat, v'sham nisahu. Say that 10 times. Like, sham sam lo, sham sam lo, sham sam lo. Sham there, sam lo were placed for him. Chok umishpat, a law and a I guess a statute. Visham, and in that place, nisau, they were tested or they were lifted up. Then the story will end with this last verse. Vayomer, and Moshe seems to say, if you will listen, surely listen to the voice of God, your God, Hashem, your God, and that which is straight in God's eyes you will do. And he will give ear to God's commandments, or God's right ways, the pathways. And you will observe all of the chukim, the laws or these statutes. Therefore, kol hamachala asher samti b'Mitzrayim, all of the illnesses or disease that I have placed in Egypt, lo asim alecha, I will not place on you, ki ani Adonai rofecha, because I am God, your healer. That's the end of the scene, right? That scene. Okay. This is an amazing scene, right? The children of Israel are on the other side of slavery. They have just burst out an absolutely unique and unrepeatable song that we continue to this day to recount. We make a special Shabbos about this about the Shabbat called the Song of the Sea, the Shabbat of Shirah, right? And Miriam, has her own little cameo appearance at the end, like Miriam, like she also was in there, but then everybody got in. The God said everybody, right? And then right after this, the immediate next moment is deprivation, and it's a deprivation of water. The water is then given to them, but they can't drink it. They come to a place that has water, but it's undrinkable. Moshe is given, like Moshe cries out to God after they cry out to him, he's given a particular, do this, and the waters are sweetened. And then this little gloss at the end, right? There they were tested. There they were told that if they keep everything that God asked them to keep and listen deeply, then they will never have to have the illnesses of Egypt. And the curtain comes down. God says, I am your healer. Amazing, right? Okay, yeah, David.
I just want just to get the scene. Is God on a megaphone? How's God telling
Yeah, he's
all
talking
these
to them
people
directly.
He's talking to them because it
It
says
doesn't say that he's talking to them directly. It says he talked to, it doesn't even say that he speaks to them. God doesn't even speak here.
if you hear God.
You also say that.
Where does God speak?
God
You
said,
said, do this.
Where does God say?
right at the bottom, God
God
said,
made
if you
for
will
them
heed
in the
your
English.
God.
God said, if you will heed your God, it will do.
Right? I think that's a mistake. I don't think that's God. In the English, I think that's not the pshat at all.
Oh, okay.
Oh, huh?
That's I'm reading.
But
No.
you said God said, do this. I don't see where he was instructed to throw the tree.
Right, it doesn't say that. Right, Vayareu doesn't say that, right?
He showed it to him.
Right,
but then
shows it to him, and
Moshe
we'll see in a minute
decided
that
what to do.
we'll see in a minute that I jumped ahead because there's that word showing is itself ambiguous. I said last night it could be showing, it could be teaching, right? We'll get to that in a second. So it's not clear that God speaks at all in this entire scene. Vayomer, right? Im shamot yishma lakol anach. That sounds like Moshe. God doesn't say that God said it.
Maybe in Hebrew it's different, because in English it sounds like he did.
No, in the English it only sounds like that because there's a little chupchik that says God inside of those parentheses. Right? In the English, there's no English. There's only Hebrew.
So the transmission is through Moses.
Moshe seems to be saying something that he would say later on quite frequently.
Okay.
The only reason why this sounds like it's God is because it says Ki ani Adonai rofecha at the end, where it says at the end, for I am God, your healer, right? So that sounds, but the first part of it doesn't sound like God at all. So that's actually why probably the English translation, it's not clear at all. It's a very ambiguous sentence because Vayomer, Im Shemot Yishma Lekol Anachal V'Yashav Einav, it's in the third person. Right? If you listen to his, and then it shifts into the first person. So the verse itself moves from the third person impersonal to the first person intimate personal, and that's why it's a very confusing way to translate it. Is the first fragment like Moshe speaking, in the second fragment, all of a sudden God's voice comes in and says, "For I am God, your healer." So they chose to say that the whole thing was from God. That's why he put it in the ellipse in that the brackets. Okay, so we have the scene. And what really struck me in last night's sermon was that there is a lot of Torah on this wood and business. And if you look the second source is from Nachmanides, but he's quoting at least 2 or 3 other earlier sources than him. Nachmanides, and the second source is already in the 13th century in Spain. He's a Kabbalist, and he's what's called one of the Rishonim, one of the early commentators. He's on the same level as the Rambam, Rashi, Rabbeinu Asher, and so on. It's like the Rif. Like you go on and on. The Ran. There are a lot of these earlier rabbis, or what we call the medieval rabbis, who have this, who are channeling earlier sources. And so he's going to give, in his commentary on this verse, he'll quote a number of different sources on the meaning of that word, and he showed him the wood. And here's where it gets really interesting, because if you like, the earlier sources are also are where he's drawing from, and they make a lot of this. So Vatam Vayoreh Hashem eitz, the meaning of that God showed Moshe a tree, and he told him, and by the way, Amar lo hashlech es ha'etz hazeh el hamayim v'yimatku, yimteku. Right now, by the way, it doesn't say Amar lo. It doesn't say, as Alan pointed out in the text, it doesn't say anywhere in the text that God said what to do with the wood, but it just says that he threw it into the water, and they sweetened. Says, because I've never seen the word moreh, that is in the word, and he showed him by yorehu, which is moreh, like moreh as a teacher, right? I've never seen the word moreh, which is, he says is the meaning of that word by yorehu, and he showed him. He's never seen it as, and he showed him. He's only seen it as, and he taught, right? He taught, right? Vayoreni, vayomerli, says in Mishlei, in Proverbs, right? My father taught me. Lim dani, v'chein kulam. He says all of them. All, like when he says kulam, he means everything in the Bible, because the Ramban had that, like before Sefaria, there was, they knew the whole Bible by heart. He says, I know, like, it doesn't appear any other place like that. He says, Nira b'derech hapshat ka'etzahu yamtik hamayim b'ti'ivo. So the simple meaning of this is, the simple meaning of what happens here is that this must be a tree that by its nature can sweeten things or sweeten water. He said, and this is like, it has this kind of magical power. It has a segula this way, magical, or it's unique in this way. I think it's more like the translation says it's unique, but I think it's a magic property of it. The segula is like a charm or some kind of, it has something to it. And he taught this to Moshe. He said, but our rabbis have taught in earlier sources, in the Midrashim, in the Mechilta, Rabbi Shmuel, and also in the Tanchuma, Shaya Eitz Mar, that the tree was not a sweetening agent, but had a bitter quality to it. V'hu nes b'toch nes, and it's a miracle within a miracle, like a double concealed miracle. Ki inyan hamelach shenosan Elisha b'mayim. If you look in the book of Kings, the story of Elisha, and the salt that was put into the water. So in other words, there's another example of this kind of nes b'toch nes, another miracle within a miracle. In Cain, Amar vayoreu ki lo haya eitz nimsa b'makom hahu. And that means, if that's the case, vayoreu, and he instructed him, indicates that the tree was not found in that place, right? In other words, he went to show him a special, like this is very mythic. We feel like King Arthur's court here, or in some mythic structure, or Tolkien or something. God showed him this mystical tree, like there's a special tree. And he showed him where it was, Excalibur, like this mystical tree, right? And it has properties that are unique to making waters bitter. He had to show this to him. Or maybe he miraculously showed him this tree, like he found this tree by miracle. And then he says, and the Ramban adds this, Vishuv matzazi b'yelamdenu midrash tanchuma. He said, and then I found, after I already seen the earlier story, I found another teaching in the Midrash. Re'ei maksiv sham vayareu Hashem eitz, vayareu lo ne'emar ela vayareu v'horahu darko, klamar shehorahu v'limedahu, darko shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu shehu mamtik amar b'mar. Says, I found in a source that there's another teaching. It says, vayareu, that he showed him, or he taught him. It doesn't say that he showed him in the word of vision, vayarehu, but vayorehu, which is to hora'ah, means to teach him something like a mentorship. He showed him, he mentored him in the path of God, because the path of God is to sweeten the bitter with the bitter. When I read this, I tell you something, it sent me down a beautiful rabbit's hole. A rabbi hole. What is this? What is this?
Homeopathy.
Yes.
We talked about this last night, homeopathic. If you assume that the pshat is that this was not a tree that was bitter, then it's not such a, I mean, then it's okay. The story has other issues to it, but this is not a particularly difficult issue. Okay? It's a sweetening agent, whatever it is. It's like, it's also fantastic. Like, what does that mean exactly? That he showed him a tree and he threw a tree into the water. It's still pretty miraculous. But if you go with the assumption in this tradition that God's way is to bring the bitter to the bitter in order to make things sweet, then what does that mean? And so I was on a search for ways that over the last couple of thousand years, or 1,500 years, that we've thought about this. You know, what does that mean exactly? And why here? And how does it explain other pieces of the text? That's the kind of my first. Yeah. So should we look at some of the ways that this has been taught? I could see Richard's hand. I just want to keep going into the text. I'll get to you in a second, Richard, okay? Let's look at one way that this text was learned. If you look at source 3.
What's the source of three?
Yeah, so I started cutting and pasting from my big database, and I think this is, all of these sources are much later. They're like this is I think this is a 19th century source, but I can go back and send it to you. I had to, I only schlepped over 2 of the source names. I should have brought them all, but I'm sorry. But just look at this one. This is one particular approach. So he says, the source says, Yesh lahavin darko shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu lahamtik mar b'mar. We have to understand, he said, why is it God's way? Like, that's what the Ramban said, or the Midrash Lamdenu said that, but this source says, okay, but why? Why does God have to make a nace through a miracle through another miracle? Lama be'emet tzarich la'asot nace b'toch nace. V'chi lo adiv lahamtik mayim. It wouldn't have been, he said, why wouldn't it have been easier to sweeten the water with something sweet? Or maybe even without using a tree at all? Like a mayim, alidei davar matok, or lahamtik mayim below eitz klal. The nearer the va'er, he says, this is one way to explain this. Al pi divrei hamidrash rabba b'parshat kitisa. One way to explain this is through the midrash in parshat kitisa. And there too, the Midrash emphasizes the language of Vayoreu as a term of teaching. It explains that when Moshe saw the bitter water, he began to ponder in his heart, saying, why were these waters created? He said, what benefit did they bring to the world? It would have been better if they had never been created. And so God knew that Moshe was thinking in his heart, and he said to him, don't say that. Are they not my creations? Is there anything in the world that was not created for a purpose? Now, in this first model, this is like an old question in like there are different proofs for God's existence. I remember studying philosophy in my 20s, and one of them was called the proof from design, the teleological proof. Its name, telos, means an end or purpose. So you look in the world and it seems to have some kind of design to it. And that implies, on some level, philosophically, a designer, right? So in the world of philosophy, that argument was torn apart by philosophers from David Hume all the way to the present day, and then again, and still people bring it up and they fight about whether it's actually a good, useful teleological proof or not. And it centers on whether or not anything in the world was created without a purpose. In other words, if there's a designer, there must be purpose for everything. But what do you do with so many things that seem to be completely purposeless? That would be the argument against the theological design argument. And back and forth they went. So this argument is that Moshe was having one of these moments. He looks at the bitter water and says, what could possibly be the purpose for bitter waters? Like, who benefits from bitter waters? God, you brought our people here. They're completely exhausted. They're thirsty beyond thirsty. They scream out and they say, really, like, we're so thirsty, but we can't drink the waters. The waters are here, but we can't do anything with them. And so it made him start to ponder in this argument or this explanation that maybe you start thinking, maybe there are things in the world that God creates that have no purpose. And God is hearing this internal argument that Moshe's having with himself. He's like, I'm a man of belief. I believe there's a purpose for everything. What's the purpose of these bitter waters? Which, of course, is what's the purpose of suffering? What's the purpose of too much suffering? What's the purpose of 400 years of slavery? What's the purpose of all this? Was there really a need to go through all of the 10 plagues? Was there really a need? Was there really a need to like, what's the point of it all? And then God shows him the bitter waters and says, everything bitter can somehow sweeten things. Like even things that you think are not a sweetening agent, I'm going to show you through the agency of the bitterness of this tree that something positive can be its effect. That's like one salvo. That's like the one, like, okay, right? That's one school, one idea. There's a second idea. Turn the page, and there's a second idea. And source 5, 4 of it. I mean, source 3. No, I think source 4, right? My source 4, I got lost. Okay, source 4. I wish I had a clock. The kasha. Now this is from the Sfas Emes. It's from Joe's favorite Hasidic, one of his favorite Hasidic masters. Mine too. People know the story of the serpent, or the in the book of Numbers. Remember this? There was a plague that breaks out in the camp, and Moshe is instructed to make what's it called in English? It's the snake that winds around the medical symbol. Fiducius, exactly. And thank you. And like he's instructed to make a nachash, a serpent on his staff. Like he turns his staff into a serpent, and they have to all look. Remember, they have to look at the serpent, and then they're healed. And it's funky, right? Like really? And the question that bothers. So the pshat of that is the simple meaning of that in the Torah is what? That somehow there's a power in that snake to heal the plague, right? Now, fast forward to the Mishnah in the 2nd century, and that magical understanding of the staff really bothers them. So what do they say in the Mishnah? The Mishnah actually brings this up. It asks a rhetorical question. It's really that the staff gives life or death? The staff? Like when Moshe's hands, also the Mishnah says, when Moshe's hands are like this, when they're at war, right, with Amalek, it says when his hands were up, they were winning, and when his hands were down, they're losing. So they had to hold up his hands, right? Aaron and Hur had to hold up his hands, right? So that bothers the rabbis of the Mishnah. Same thing. Did they look at the staff? God is the one. What do you look at some serpent and somehow you're alive, and when you're not looking at the serpent, you're dead?
Is there some other magic trick with the serpent turning into the staff?
Yeah, that's earlier when he's in Pharaoh's court, right? And remember, and then the magicians they swallow he swallows the magician's staff, but okay. But this bothers the magic of this all, the implications of the magic as a secondary or primary source that is somehow distinct from God, bothers the rabbis of the Mishnah. And so they say, what do they say? They say it's not that the staff really worked or that the hands, but when the hands were up, the people of Israel looked at Moshe's hands, and it reminded them, it was as if Moshe was going like this. And when his hands were down, they were like this. But when his hands were up, they were looking up to God. They said, oh, who's the ultimate source, right?
Like a football player.
Exactly. The football player saying, I want to give all glory to God. So it was like, glory to God. And when the staff was a similar thing, and so you'll see here that in this Sfas Emes, he wants to connect this whole thing, like all of these pieces together. Why did there have to be a miracle within a miracle? It's almost like a double, it was almost like God's power is even more profoundly, accentuated. Let's look at this. The kasha, it's difficult to understand. This is our second interpretation of mar b'mar, bitter in bitter. If the whole purpose was that they should direct their gaze upward towards heaven, why do they need to make a serpent at all? Hello, Efshar Areris Aistaklus Biladei Anachash Legamre. Isn't it possible to get them to start looking up to heaven without having to look at this serpent? Right? So this can be understood. Now he's going to quote the Ramban. He's going to quote the Ramban that we learned in the first source from here in our parsha. Shekasav Ramban Sham Ki Akash Baruch Hu Tziva. That's a spelling error. That God commanded Moshe lasos de musraf hamemis osam lahodi amal yidei zeh lenashuch nachash misukan listakel v'nachash hamashpi alav l'ra v'chozos kan ayahepech. So he says something brilliant. He says, making a serpent for those who have just been bitten by a serpent is exactly the opposite thing that you should want to do to heal them. If they've been bitten by a serpent, which was what was happening in the story, how would looking at a serpent help them? It would scare them even more. It's like not a smart way diagnostically to work with people who have just been, bitten by a serpent or who had some plague. But he says that counterintuitive move, right? It was the opposite of the healing, right? The opposite was true here. They were healed through this act, for it is God who brings death and gives life, and his way is to sweeten the bitter with the bitter. And this is what the sages meant when they said that through the serpent healing them, they lifted their eyes upward and cast their burdens upon their Father in heaven, and thus they were healed. In other words, in our story, God tells Moshe to put the bitter into the bitter in order to heighten the impact of the miraculous. If the tree was sweet and Moshe throws a sweetening agent into the water, then they think, oh, it's a miracle that he found the tree. But really, it sounds very naturalistic. Like you just add a little spoonful of sugar and it helps the water go down, and it's all beseder. But according to the Sfas Emes, the bitter and the bitter is exactly the most counterintuitive way you would ever imagine healing coming about, and in that way, there's no doubt whatsoever that the healer, the real healer, is not nature, but God. That's salvo number 2, right? The first one was that God shows him, right, that the bitter into the bitter was, right, and the bitter here rather is because of the miraculous nature, right, that it comes as a complete upending of human rationality. In this sense, it also very much speaks to one of the church fathers who once wrote that it was only because it is absurd that I believe. Right? It's Tertullian, exactly. So Tertullian, that notion of the dangerous notion, but also to some degree, Zen-like notion, that it's only when something is not in full rational comprehension that it points beyond itself. Right? The Marir becomes like a token or a representation of the absurd. The bitter, can the bitter really make the bitter sweet? And in this text, God says, that's my way. My way is to show you that it's, right? Like the Gemara says, who decided that oil would light? Right? Who said that oil is supposed to be combustible? I set the laws of nature on a path, and I can subvert the laws of nature. And here, after God, of course, splits the Red Sea, it should not surprise us that God also wants to underscore that when you're thirsty, right? When you're thirsty and God provides, it'll be God who is helping quench your thirst and not, right, some more naturalistic way.
It's pretty clear. He says, Ki ani Hashem.
Right. So now Alan says so beautifully. Alan says, and that's what makes sense in some profound way of the end of this story. God says, if you listen to me, all of the ways of Egypt won't attack you, right? You won't be sick in the ways of Egypt, because I, God, Ani Adonai Rofecha, I am your healer. Ani Adonai Rofecha. So, okay, so far so good, everybody with me? Okay, I know that we probably have 1 million people's hands up. Let's just do one more, and then we'll go around the room, and yeah. This next source will actually back up what we just read, but it will not only read the part about the end of the story with God being the healer and the true doctor, but it will also connect us to the word chok, that is used at the end of the story, where it says, Sham Sam Lo Chok, God there gave them chukim. Do people know the difference classically in rabbinic philosophy or rabbinic thought between the kinds of laws, like a mishpat versus a chok versus a... So I'll give a primer, just a reminder. So in traditional in traditional rabbinic sources, there are many parts of the Torah that are rational, or we would call natural religion, or things that make sense, like morality, right? Those are subsumed under like mishpat. Mishpat is like something just that you might have come to on your own. There are other kinds of laws that have to do with ritual that makes sense too, but the reasons aren't given, but they're not obvious, like Shabbat. We understand it on some level, but it's not incomprehensible. It kind of isn't it's not in the same category necessarily as thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal, but it's kind of a ritual that makes sense. It's a reason honoring God who created the world, and by desisting from work, right? Then there's a third category of laws, and into this category, the rabbis place things like the red heifer, the laws of kashrut, the shatnez, like not mixing wool and linen, not mixing different species of plants and things like that. These general rules in the Torah that are kind of like what? You should call them what rules. They're called chukim. They're called chukim. So it's chukas Torah. Like a chok is a law, it's a statute, but it has a quality of being engraved. It's something that is immutable. It's given. You might not, you don't get it, but you still have to do it. You don't get it, but you do it. Okay? Now, that word appears here in our story at the end, right? It says there in that place, Sham, Sam Lo Chok Mishpat. The part about Mishpat. The rabbis say in their gloss on this is at Mara, the Jews received a little bit of the laws that they would later get at Mount Sinai. Right? They got the laws of Shabbat, Mishpat, but also the laws of the red heifer. So in this next commentary, which is really a connection to the piece we just learned about things that you don't quite grok or things that are a little bit beyond your mind, bitter within bitter, is connected to chukim, to laws that we just don't get. Right? So listen to this next source. Hakavana, this is source number 5. V'yos Shama. The idea is that when Moshe, our teacher of blessed memory, sweetened the water with the bitter tree, it was against the natural order, something that human reason cannot comprehend. She'eina seichel sovalto. Eich amar himtikes amar. How did the bitter sweeten the bitter? How can the bitter sweeten the bitter? This is similar to the concept of a chok, of a divine decree without an apparent rationale, which lacks an understandable reason. It appears that God performed this wondrous act, davar pele, which is the word in Hebrew pele, it's a wondrous thing, lahamtik mar b'mar, v'shir'u b'einayim sha'amar himtik amar, that they would witness with their own eyes that the bitterness can sweeten bitterness, even though it defies logical understanding. And this was done so that when they encountered the statutes, the chukim, they would not reject them, even though these laws have no apparent rationale and are beyond human reason. For they had already seen with their own eyes something that a person would not believe if merely heard, unless they had witnessed it firsthand. They could then testify and proclaim that the bitter sweetens the bitter. And thus it says, and God showed him a tree, and he cast it into the water, and the water became sweet. Through the sweetening of the water by means of something that defies logic, God established the principle of statutes and ordinances. In other words, right, by sweetening the bitter with the bitter, he implanted within their hearts the concept of a chok, even though it is something that reason cannot grasp. So you see that not only is it an underscoring of what you said, Alan, about the end of the story is that God says, I alone, right, the one who is the author of the power, but I can make the miraculous into the everyday. And don't be bothered by the fact that what I'm asking you to do is not exactly, doesn't, align with your understanding of the way the world works. We have 2 more of these, but I'm going to stop now because that's a lot, and I want to hear thoughts and questions before we take it into a much more Hasidic and internal place. I will ask again, as I ask every week, to please remain on this topic and really only comment on this topic and on what we studied and on your thoughts or your contributions to this to this topic. Okay, so we'll start in the Zoom this week, and then we'll go to the room. We'll reverse the order. Richard, Jay, and Marilyn, and then we'll come back into the room. Go ahead, Richard. You're on the air.
Thank you, David. Everett Fox, in introducing this section, says that God has to instruct the people twice. The very verb from which the term Torah is derived, and is that what he's referencing to Vayorehu? Is that the same root as Torah?
Yeah, that's the idea, that the Torah, that the idea of Torah as the word vayer from the word lahorot, or to teach, right, or to show, but that's the general idea. Yeah, if that makes sense. So it's, yeah, vayoreu is that he showed him, but the Ramban and others said that it's really from the word moreh, to teach him. So God taught him his way. We're really having some struggles here. Let's go back here. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes. The only other thought I'd throw out for someone that knows more mathematics is, isn't there a concept in mathematics that if you multiply two negative numbers together, you get a positive? Varti.
Shamati. Okay, Jay.
Shabbat
us-
Shalom. A quick
Shabbos, Jay.
reaction. Can you hear me? Yeah,
We hear you.
thank you. A quick reaction and then thought. The reaction is I'm blown away by, there's a truth in writing poetry, for example, show, don't tell. And the idea of connecting that to the key method of teaching, you show, you don't tell, is a wonderful idea. As another interpretation to deepen the layers of the sweeten via using bitter on bitter, there's another concept we've come across a number of times, yerida letzorech aliyah, and I'm wondering if that might not also apply here.
So Jay's quoting a Hasidic teaching that there's a descent for the sake of ascent, to go down, to go up, and it is connected. In general, bitterness and then like the bitter and then the sweet is a similar idea. All of Egypt is like we went down to Egypt in order to kind of rise back up, and in Kabbalah you go down into the shells or into the dark place to retrieve sparks of light and things like that. So yeah, it's the general principle here holds. It's the doubling of the darkness that itself is mysterious. Not that the darkness precedes the light, because also we have that in the beginning of the Torah. The choshech is there before the light, and that itself is kind of like a narrative expression of this deep truth in our tradition, that we might say, if we're Buddhistly inclined, that taking a precious incarnation is kind of going into the world in order to be liberated through the world, is itself kind of a descent for the sake of an ascent, or a constriction for the sake of a release. Those are kind of the rhythms of it. Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment, but thank you for that. Marilyn, Montreal.
Wow, I love this teaching. And
I knew you would.
I actually wrote a song. It's on Bandcamp, exactly on that. I am your healer. I am the one that changes bitter to sweet. But where I went today is I jumped right ahead to, there's actually a bitter pointing to when Moses strikes the water with the staff instead of just holding the staff over the water to give them water that time. And God is upset because the people were supposed to see, they were supposed to see that this came from God. And the other thing that I see now, or I've been taught now, is I sort of jumped in my song from I am the one that changes bitter to sweet, I am your healer. I skipped over that whole part that said, and if you follow my commandments, etc., etc. And it's yes, it's all about God, but it's not all about God because there has to be some human action in between. God could have dropped the stick into the water without Moses, right? There has to be this human action that leads to the miracle, that points back to God again. And last thing,
Right.
that Sam and
Right.
Sham, that one dot, that one little dot that moves from Sham to Sam, that's that little homeopathic dot. The party.
Shamati, but that last thing was you just dropped a little bomb in there at the end there. Up until the last piece, I felt like generally, Marilyn, you're absolutely spot on, and that's a general comment about pointing in the direction of the divine. That, right? Maybe if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that the doubling of this, that like the sweet that goes, the expectation that sweet is the only thing that can make bitter coffee sweet is sweetener. But to add something bitter to coffee to make it more sweet is right. What you're saying is the analog of that is like when Moshe in the rock, he took, like, there's no way that Moshe should be taking credit, and by not speaking to the rock, there might have been the presumption that hitting it is what works, and because Moshe did it, instead of speaking to it, right, I get it. So like that's your general principle, that it has to be transparently God at play. And here there's an example of that, like the doubling of the bitter, like leaves no room for doubt that this is miraculous in a way that had it been sweet. You got that. The third thing that you said, which was really strong, is that there's something about the Sham Sam and the identical words used, it's actually 3 times in that last verse. Sham Sam lo chok umishpat v'sham nisahu, like that there's the repetition of these 2 letters, shin and mem, and the changing of one from sham to sam. It's also very intense what you said, because just that little dot changes the word from there to placing, but it also, in an oral sense, also moves from there to potion. The word sam is with a samech, and that's a sam is like a potion. And so there's something in what you said also brilliant and creative about that little dot that has me thinking. But let's take a couple of thoughts in the room, and then the last 2 sources that I want us to look at before we call it a morning. Anybody thoughts in here? Paul, Shaul.
I'm struck by there's sort of a tragic element to this, which is that this scene mimics to me the plagues. It's another plague, the plague of bitter water.
Yes.
And so what is different about bitter water versus gnats or boil in their essence? And the answer, I think, is nothing. And what's really important here is that God, the divine, is trying to communicate with its creation in a deliberately imperfect way. It's as if the divine is having a conversation with itself, which is how can it direct, how can it properly show its creations in a way to understand it and to worship it and respect it. And the divine is confounded. It doesn't know ultimately because it fails. It never convinces Pharaoh. And it's stated one of the points of the plague is for Pharaoh and the Egyptians to understand and respect the power of the Lord. But it never gets there. Pharaoh ultimately died in the water. Or the Egyptians died in the water almost. So it fails. And so we're here again. Now, on the other side of the Red Sea begins again this process of how the divine should go about properly its task. And we're being pulled along on this conversation, this mission. And it doesn't work out so well.
So interesting. I would have thought intuitively, reading the plague stories, is that the point is not actually to convince the Egyptians at all, but to convince the Israelites
As well.
as well. And to some degree, every time the Egyptians are persuaded, God doubles down and makes sure that they're not. Right? And so there is a cruel element to that God in the story, the God of the Bible has taken revenge against them and is kind of playing with them. But there's also what you're saying, I think very powerfully, is that the real education here is for the Israelites. And what better moment after the splitting of the sea to remind the Israelites to not forget that, which is something that they can't seem to stop doing, that I am the one who makes the bitter sweet. I am the one who takes you out of Egypt. I'm the one, right? I'm the one that will heal you if you let me and trust me, but they don't, which is, I agree with you. They certainly don't get that. And this is a harbinger of a horrible, wilderness experience. Like, what do you want me to do? I'm going to give you water from rocks. I'm going to give you water from bitterness. I'm going to do like, what more do I have to do to prove to you that you're safe, that you're in my hands? And they can't get it. They just can't get it.
But I'm also saying that there's an internal conversation.
The God is also, but you're blaming God because you're saying God doesn't figure out a way.
We're being led
into this
an internal conversation that divine is having with itself, which is what's the right way.
What's the right way to teach and show these? How can I get through? I can't get through to them. I can't get through to them. Yeah, that's a powerful and sympathetic way to view God as struggling, like a good teacher or parent, to get through to a student or a child, and they just don't know, and they're just throwing everything on a wall. Like, I'm trying to get them to trust me, and they just can't. Do I try this? Do I try that? Am I harsh? Am I soft? I feel very identified with that. It's very strong. It's very strong. Anybody else before? Oh, okay, Sarah. Yeah.
Hey, so sorry. Could you come forward and speak into the mic more, please? Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you for this teaching. It's really meaningful. It makes me think about something a little different, but I think which connects very much to the conversation we're having in the room and on Zoom at the moment. And that is, I've been grappling with the notion of doubling for a while, and my head went to the notion of double concealment, which I think comes from the Baal Shem Tov.
Yes.
And it strikes me that perhaps the only way, the only antidote to a double concealment is a double miracle. And so there is an unwinding of potential of double concealment in what we're talking about here. And that, for me, is very striking, because how else could the Israelites get an understanding of divine presence without a miracle inside a miracle? So
that's so great. So just to show all of you as students that when we learn these masters, it's not as though they have access to ways of thinking that you and I and others don't have, because like what you just said, Sarah, is found in, I looked it up, there are 184 sources in the literature, in the Hasidic literature, that have this quote, the bitter within the bitter. I must have looked at like 60 of them, and at least, and a huge number, they quoted the Baal Shem Tov and the double concealment teaching, which we'll get to in a second. And so for those who don't know the teaching, the Baal Shem Tov said, there's nothing worse, he said, than when you want to play hide and seek and you go to hide and nobody looks for you. So, and he said, that's the meaning of, in the Deuteronomy, in the curses of the book of Deuteronomy, where God says, and on that day I will conceal, yes, conceal. It's a double, haster, astir, like I'll conceal, yes, conceal. Baal Shem Tov says, the double concealment of God is that God will be so hidden that people won't look. The God's hiddenness will be hidden. And so people, if God's hidden and people say, oh, God's hidden, I'm going to look for God, that's one thing. But when God's hiddenness is itself hidden, then people walk in the world as if there's nothing to look for. And so it's kind of double concealment, the Baal Shem Tov said. And it's kind of like, in many ways, it's just like a bigger topic. It's like, it is very Zen. It's a koan, because there is a not looking for, which is not because there's nothing to look for, but because you've already found it. And the looking itself would lead you away from the found. Right? But there is a double concealment, maybe, where you're so mired in karma, in dukkha, in samsara, in suffering, in whatever it is, where you've already given up on you don't even know that you gave up a long time ago, so you're not looking. And this can very much be the adult, right, who lost child consciousness. They don't know that the child once wanted to love. Like, there's a lot of ways to read this, right, where, and this is why we're gonna finish with these Hasidic teachings about what the bitterness is. And for many of them, the bitterness that is the double bitterness is the minute you're aware that you are embittered, that adds bitterness. That awareness of your bitterness adds bitterness to your bitterness, right? But it's the only way home, is that you have to realize how embittered you are. And that first moment, that first step seems to make things only worse. Like letting light into a room, and you thought like, oh, there was no dirt in the room, and all of a sudden now there's light in the room. Like, I was better off when I didn't know how dirty it was. Because now I'm suffering looking around at how filthy it was. I was fine. Like, why did you have to open the door? Because I was completely inoculated from how horrible it was, because I was numb. And now I'm feeling, and feeling is horrible, and I don't want to feel. So this is the Rav Simcha Bunim, source number 7. Isa Baramban. He quotes the Ramban. It is explained in the Ramban that God taught Moshe the way of God, which is to sweeten the bitter with the bitter. To understand this, number 7, one must recognize that sin and transgression, God forbid, have an effect even in the higher realms. The primary rectification or tikkun comes through heartfelt remorse and bitterness, to the point where one nearly pours out their bitterness like water upon realizing the sin they've committed and becoming aware of the damage that it has caused in the higher worlds. It's not through actions alone that this bitterness of the heart is sweetened and everything corrected. Good deeds and righteous actions do not have the same transformative effect. Rather, they only serve as a protection and a shielding from punishment. That is the meaning of Vayoreu. He showed him. It is a term of counsel. Vayoreu eitz, that he showed him eitz, a tree, means that he gave him eitzah, a counsel, a good advice. He taught him that the way to true repentance is through the bitterness of the heart, and that this very bitterness sweetens the bitterness caused above, and thus sweetening the bitter with the bitter. So Rav Simcha Bunim says that there's a, if we take it out of its religious language and we just speak about mistakes or the desire to improve or the awareness of those things in our lives that where things are difficult, like there's a way of feeling into that bitterness on a personal level, but also on a cosmic level, where we recognize that we've contributed to bringing something to the world that was unhealthy. And then when we realize that, it adds the bitterness to that bitter residue of that action. We might also say that, right, where the things that, let's do the second teaching from the second teaching as well, and see how these two things connect, these two last teachings. Sweetening the bitter with the bitter is its source number 8. Sweetening the bitter with the bitter is achieved by persisting in the service of God even when it feels bitter. Now this is a different teaching, but they're connected in some way. Right? The prior teaching that Rav Simcha Bunim was to say that God, it wasn't a tree that was given to him. It was given, he gave him counsel that to be bitter over the bitterness that one caused is itself a healing of that bitterness. Right? That as if the double bitterness is the bitterness of the self in recognition of the bitterness that one has caused, right, in the world. And they're both real, but they can bring about a sweetening. But here's where he goes a little bit towards the double concealment, I think. Yeah. That go down to the section where it says, this is the essence of bitter. When one feels deep bitterness over their degraded state and returns to God with heartfelt sincerity and profound inner emotion, through this very bitterness, the bitter is sweetened. and they will merit the closeness of God, and the merciful one will accept their repentance with compassion and favor. And this is reflected in the episode of the waters of Marah. They traveled for 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. The sages said that when they went 3 days without Torah, because they went without Torah, they arrived at Marah and could not drink the water because it was bitter. And it was commonly taught by our master, the holy Baal Shem Tov, who interpreted the Midrash, that because it was bitter refers to their own deeds. That the people of Israel were in a state of bitterness because they had gone without Torah for some time. In other words, they'd fallen into a place of forgetfulness. And therefore, they could not drink the water, for everything depends on human actions, right? And since they had distanced themselves, right, from the knowing, right, from the connection to Torah, which is a connection to the divine, right, the divine flow itself was diminished. So when Moshe cried out to God and God showed him a tree, this taught him for all generations that the bitter sweetens the bitter. That is, through the very flaw created by the absence of Torah, they would merit to sweeten the bitterness. And thus everything returns to its proper place in peace. So in this second teaching, it's a little bit of Simcha Bunim, but it's a little bit different. It's not that the bitterness that our actions have caused, we become aware of that, and then that itself is something that we have to work through to come to a sweeter place or to a more content place. He says that what bitter added to bitter here means the double concealment, that when you become aware that you have gone 3 days, 3 years, 3 decades without connection, when that awareness first pops into your mind, right, it's a puncturing of the double concealment. You're like, oh, what have I been doing? And that bitterness, which is itself, like, it's the first thing that arises often, is like, oh, I'm so disconnected, right? That pain itself, he says, is the bitter added to the bitter reality of your disconnection that sweetens the path forward. Like the first moment of awareness that you are disconnected becomes itself the sweetening agent. It's that awareness of the negative that Richard Yaskin was saying, the negative plus the negative equals the positive. Like that primary pain of, oh, I'm not connected. I'm out of alignment. I'm underneath the line. Or I'm, right? Now, this might come after a period of disconnection. And during that period of disconnection, you became so inured to the need to connect that it became your regular way. So you wake up one morning, you realize how much, your disconnection has wrought in your life. I had a friend in a conversation with me this week who, a dear friend who just came back from, he went and did ayahuasca. And he was a person that became an extremely successful person in the world. And he realized when he did the medicine that one of his superpowers was being super disconnected. Like that's what brought him success in that world that he was in. In order to survive as a child, he said he promised himself that he would always protect himself before anybody else. And if anybody would threaten him, he would destroy them. And when into the world of business, he said that mindset really worked. That was exactly his superpower, that he could completely disconnect. And he became intensely aware of the Christ that this connection had on the people in his life. He absolutely needed to be connected to. It wasn't like he could just turn it on and off. The very thing that made him successful in one area of his life was really what hurt him in another area of his life. And we talked about how bitter it was to make that recognition. But then we talked about how that bitterness was added, was a sweetening agent. Because when he added that bitter to the bitterness of his realization, it really prompted him to want to bring more sweetness into his life. So that's like the maror, like maybe a bit sad that we eat the maror. Maybe we should eat the maror first without any charoset, and then only after that, then eat with charoset. So why are we doing this teaching today on Shabbat Shira and on